All right, good morning, everyone. Again, this is Jason Passini with IBM's Hybrid Cloud Sales Team, and this is our weekly integration and development webcast. So for those of you that did participate in last week's session, you'll know that we had Kim Clark from our offering management team kick off a five-part mini-series regarding Agile integration architectures. And on Friday, we opened things up by talking about the need to break up the ESB. And today is going to be a kind of a continuation along that vein where we're going to be focused on decentralizing integration. So Kim has rejoined us. I believe he's got maybe 20, 25 minutes or so of content prepared for today. And at the end of his presentation, we'll allow for a few moments of Q&A. So if you do want to have some direct interaction with Kim and get you the answers to your questions, we could certainly do so. And I know last week we did get a lot of requests for copies of the presentation. So I will be certain to share that recording with any of you that request it. I have also started a box folder that's got copies of all the recordings that we've created year to date. So if you're interested in getting added to that, I can take care of that this afternoon as well. And I know we're running a little bit behind today, so I'll quickly hand things over to Kim. And Kim, if you like, you can take things away. And I'm sure everyone will find this to be a very valuable session. Last week, we had some tremendous feedback. It was one of our most highly attended sessions of the year. So I'm expecting you'll get a lot out of this one as well.
That's great to hear. Thanks, Jason. So yeah, Kim Clark with you again. And you'll notice also on the slides I've got the name Nick Glowacki. Nick was also a co-author of the e-booklet that we've written on Agile integration architecture, and he put a significant amount into the chapter around decentralization, which is today's topic. So I just wanted to make sure his name was on there as well. But he's not going to be talking on the call today. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it, so it's just me. Just to give you a quick refresher, so Agile integration architecture, an approach to integration that takes on board the different styles of application development that we see today, things like microservices architecture and technologies like containerization, and looks to see how it can embrace those and enable us to do integrations more effectively. And last week we focused more on the first of the three categories you see here, which is the fine-grained deployment, and specifically talking about the breaking up of the enterprise service bus. Next week I'll probably be taking a tour into the cloud-native infrastructure itself and looking at the benefits of containers in general, and then nailing down the specific benefits for different aspects of integration. But this week we're going to take a closer look at this aspect called decentralization. And decentralization in a nutshell is really where something that's happening to the IT industry in general, and therefore has a knock-on effect in integration, where teams are able to achieve a lot more as a business-funded, business-led team, just using capabilities that are available through operational expenditure budgets and things like that to actually get started and get moving and create real IT as a shadow IT department rather than as part of the centralized department. And that's having a knock-on effect on all aspects of IT, but of course has a specific effect within the integration space. So I'm going to go back to the architectural diagrams that I used last week, but I'm going to talk to them very specifically around how they affect the people that are involved. So we spoke last week about how the enterprise service bus, which is what you see with the red box around it in the diagram on the left there, is the way that we've been exposing for many years now multiple integrations of multiple back-end systems. It's a heavily centralized approach. Often a very centralized infrastructure, a single, perhaps pair of integration hubs sitting next to each other as an HA pair, exposing multiple different integrations, perhaps hundreds or even thousands of integrations, and also being run probably by a centralized team, a team that doesn't necessarily know the back-end systems of record in great depth, certainly not the detail of the data models. And that team have to switch across all sorts of different protocols and communication mechanisms as well. They are a physically separate team, potentially, to the back-end systems of record and indeed to the engagement applications at the front. And so as a result of that, you end up with a very waterfall style of requirements being fed to that team. It potentially takes a very long time to realize a particular service that you want to expose. So big challenges for that team. Even though they're ultimately succeeding in creating hopefully reusable services, the time to market, if you like, is just too slow. And so the next step was to break up that the integration hub into smaller containers, each container owning a small number of integrations, allowing the centralized team to break up into potentially smaller teams or assign tasks on a more granular basis so that people could really get to know a particular area and deploy it and change it without worrying about other areas of integration. Be able to use the features in the integration engine that are new whenever they want to, rather than having to wait for the whole infrastructure to be upgraded and so on. But really, that's already starting to break apart this very central team. They can start to break into smaller groups. And the logical conclusion of that is that they may well become specialized towards particular applications. And there's a real advantage to this. If you imagine as a team start to gravitate towards an application, they might as well actually consider joining that application team and reducing that life cycle, that waterfall life cycle that was occurring by passing requirements to a separate team, and start to gain a deeper knowledge of those particular skilled areas. So they can now build out integrations for that particular application and start to focus specifically on that. And the furthest reach of this is to then look at, well, maybe where we're building applications in the style of modern microservice applications, consider using the integration tool as just another tool in the toolbox of the application developer, getting it to a point where it's sufficiently straightforward to build integrations that anybody from the application team could potentially take that on and make use of the productivity enhancements of a tool that enables you to build integrations. Now, as I'll come on to later, there's an effect that's happened across these four diagrams, not just on that integration hub, but also on the way that gateways are broken up for the exposure aspects of the APIs. And we also see different uses of the asynchronous communication rather than just the synchronous as well. And that's something that we'll drill into certainly in later weeks. But what you've seen primarily, hopefully, is that there's a significant and very visual effect of decentralization and the responsibility for integration moving towards those application teams. So let's have a think about what that would really feel like if you're on the ground in one of the teams today. So if you were in an integration team today, a large group of people, or with a very specific specialism across integration as a whole, but over time, it's inevitable that each member of that team is going to have done more integrations in a particular space. It's always going to be the way that you'll have spent probably more time integrating to one application than another, and you end up with specialisms. And so over time, you'd eventually start to gravitate towards perhaps a particular individual applications and starting to understand. I mean, if you take, for example, integrating with a mainframe, there's only a certain number of ways of exposing a synchronous service from a mainframe. There are choices, and some choices will have benefits over other choices, and where you do the integration, whether you do it closer to the integration or outside closer to the mainframe or further away from it. At which point you do the transformations, what security models you take on, and so on. And so those sort of details become really important as you become a specialist for integration in that space. And so moving down into those teams, you can start to think more about how you can make it more patternized, more straightforward to achieve, so that you don't just become the only integration specialist in the team that can perform integrations with that mainframe. You actually enable others in the team to do that as well. And so you end up with it being easy for you to really focus on improving productivity in the application team based on that particular type of integration. Repeatable patterns are nearly always down at the level of the real technology specifics. And so having people that are dedicated to a particular application is more likely to generate that kind of productivity benefit. And more fundamentally, we've removed that separate central team, so you're working in lockstep with the same potentially release cycles of the application, and you're involved in the same project meetings and the same operational meetings as well. So we can certainly see advantages of doing it this way, and it's something that many organizations would always wanted to do. The only reason they couldn't do it was potentially the way that they had to provision, skill up on integration software in the past, but that's certainly changed quite dramatically over the years. So another role that would also probably occur, and is a bit harder to describe on a diagram, is the consultancy role. So there'll be deep integration specialists who would visit these teams individually and assist them with individual integration design problems. And so rather than being part of a separated integration design team, they would be sort of consultants almost that would step in and assist various projects and applications. And we often see this in other areas as well. We see this in security, we see this in networking, that there are individuals who bring a skill into a team, bring them up to speed, bring them up to another level, and then move on. And so that role would certainly fit into this decentralization approach as well. So what we're really dealing with here, if you look at the two sides of that equation, is a balance between control and being able to deliver faster. So control to enable the enterprise to continue delivering the services and the capabilities that it's been doing for some time, compared to delivery, where if we enable these autonomous teams, these business teams, to have a much more open mechanism for choosing the technologies they want and exploring things really quickly, then they'll get much more freedom. There is a danger in either side. So if we go too far in the control direction, we end up with that sort of team waterfall requirements effect, or an analysis paralysis, where we try and work out the perfect services across everything. And if we go too far in the delivery freedom direction, we end up with a little bit too much Wild West, rock stars who can do some amazing things, but we don't understand any of the code they've written after they moved on. A very short-term view to solving a problem that doesn't pay out well when we come to try and maintain it. And what we're trying to do is retain some kind of balance in the middle, where we gain the level of consistency that we need, but we also allow people the freedom that they need as well. So we have some sort of guardrails that people can fit within. A common approach to doing this is as we're letting people drift into these individual application teams, this is an approach that the microservices architecture takes on board a lot, is the idea of having guilds. So rather than having a top-down approach to the description of how you're going to achieve a particular problem, with a sort of ivory tower group of architects trying to push ideas down onto the various teams, it's done from the ground up. We start with individuals in the teams solving a problem for their area, and then coming together to find how other teams have solved that same problem into a guild that perhaps focuses on, it could be on build automation for integration, or it could be on a particular style of handling data mapping, or a particular connectivity to a style of application. And solving that problem, bringing their own knowledge to the table from what they've tried to achieve in their own team. And that's more likely to build the kind of consensus that we're after. And this is the sort of the constant cycle that we have between people learning things on the ground and then bringing them together and trying to find better ways of doing things so they can then take those back out to the team. And it fits very well into this sort of decentralized model of the ownership still being with the teams to deliver, but ultimately if they can build a greater consensus within the guilds, then they've got a chance of delivering more effectively. So moving on from that to taking a look at all of the things that were described in that set of 4 diagrams and some more as well. The truth of the matter is that it's not going to be a big bang shift from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. What we're going to see in most organizations for many years to come is a mixture. And so we're going to have some of that centralized enterprise service bus perhaps remaining for some time. That centralized team may still have some kind of a role for some time, but they may be building integrations, their new integrations, in a different way. They may be building them in this more containerized way. You could argue that if they're building integrations that are that don't fit with an individual application team, if you grouped a set of those integrations together, maybe they would become an application domain in their own right. So rather than thinking of it as one big integration team, it can actually be broken up into sort of integration application areas that are more specific to business needs and business services. And then gradually we'll start to see, as that sort of mechanism becomes more and more fluid, more and more straightforward, and the skills to handling things like Kubernetes and Docker in the integration space become more familiar, then the application teams will have a desire to take on ownership of the same integrations. And just to be clear here, we're not necessarily talking, as we see the small integrations moving from that traditional integration in space in the middle down to the systems of record, we're not necessarily saying that that's then a separate platform that they're sitting on. They could still be sitting in a centralized Kubernetes architecture. The point is that they're being owned, deployed, and maintained by the application team. The application team may choose to have a separate infrastructure, but they could be sharing a central one. So it's really important to get across what it is that's being decentralized. It's ownership of the building and maintaining of the integrations that's being decentralized, not necessarily the infrastructure itself. That could be shared. And then as we move further across, we can then see up towards the top the microservices applications potentially taking on the tooling of integration. And I've shown just on the very far right of the diagram an iPaaS, an integration platform as a service. So that's another way of allowing integrations to be created quickly in a platform that exists, so a cloud-based platform that allows you to build applications in the cloud and explore that without having to necessarily be an integration specialist, without having to build any infrastructure. And so it fits with this category of the audience on the right-hand side who are more about agility and experimentation and trying things out. And the people on the left-hand side are more focused on the keeping the existing integrations stable and making sure that they've got really good governance and control around those existing integrations. So we can see we've got two very different factions with competing concerns, but working in a collaborative way. And I think more and more we'll see those teams working more and more closely together rather than being separate factions as they can be sometimes today. Looking at that same diagram from another angle, the three aspects of Agile integration architecture that I talked about, the fine-grained deployment, breaking things into containers, decentralization that we're talking about today, and cloud-native integration infrastructure and primarily containers, the skill set, the maturity of an organization in each of those spaces is going to vary. The needs are going to vary depending which teams are actually taking on Agile integration architecture. So if we're talking about that centralized integration team, it's really going to be more about learning how to break things up, learning what the dividing lines are going to be for which integrations should live together and which ones can be broken apart. And so the focus is going to be on the fine-grained nature. But as soon as we start to look at the application teams taking it on, it's all of these challenges, really management and organizational challenges of enabling multi-skilled teams to thrive in the application domains. And so decentralization becomes the thing that's most important there. For the microservices teams themselves to take on the idea of Agile integration architecture, you really need the maturity in all the different areas. And so it's perfectly understandable why that's going to come last, because you've got to be able to do things in a fine-grained manner, be decentralized in your approach and also be very, very up to speed on container architectures. So that's a fairly quick walkthrough of what we mean in depth by this idea of decentralization. In Agile integration architecture, as we discussed last week, really breaks up into how those three aspects, the fine-grained, decentralized, and cloud-native, affect three different areas of integration. There's the application integration perspective, which is mostly what I talked about last week, of the breaking up of the enterprise service bus. And we've just discussed in some fairly obvious terms how that would be affected by decentralization. But we can also look at it from a perspective of how those services that we're exposing, or APIs that we're exposing internally and externally, are also being decentralized themselves. So the ability to expose APIs using modern API management capabilities is very different to it was in the older days of the centralized ESB and the service registries that were around at the time. In API management, it's much more achievable for an application team to come along and expose their own APIs using graphical user interfaces that are designed specifically for that purpose, and then push that out onto a gateway that enables them to perform that exposure, control traffic management, provide security patterns, and so on. So we'll see when we talk in a later session in a couple of weeks' time, really how that sort of whole idea of a more fine-grained approach and a decentralized approach to API exposure affects that technology as well. And then finally, the messaging territory too has become more decentralized, messaging being required in multiple different clouds because these decentralized teams need the ability to be able to choose the cloud vendor that suits them best for the infrastructure they want. And so being able to work in a multi-cloud style, and also to be able to write applications that are more decoupled from messaging infrastructure. And so the teams can be more effective in working with a more service-led, self-administered style of messaging as well. So we see that decentralization actually cuts right through, not just into the integration hub space, but also into the API management space and into the messaging space. As of course I'm from IBM, and we have a suite of products that cover this entire area, and so our aim is to provide that as a platform that you can work around moving between these different capabilities, these different areas of messaging, API management, and deep integration in a cohesive way. And our aim is to make decentralization more and more straightforward, so that there are more and more capabilities to enable you to try things out for free and experiment, teams to be able to upskill on integration software, simplifying the interfaces used to create and expose APIs and provision messaging environments and so on, so that this idea of being able to decentralize becomes more and more possible, and drawing people hopefully together onto a single platform in order to do that. So plenty of links and references. There's a set of blogs at the bottom, which is where we post most of the new stuff around Agile integration architecture. Thank you for bearing with me, things starting a little bit later today. But that concludes the discussion points that I was going to go through so far.
Great, thank you, Kim. Folks, I do see that there's a couple of questions in the chat now, but if folks would like to take themselves off mute and pose questions directly to Kim, we could do that as well. But for now, I'll work through what I see in the chat. Also, what I'm going to be doing is opening up the poll. So for those of you that have participated the past couple of weeks, we're just more interested in trying to collect some of your feedback, and going to launch that in just a second here. So if you wouldn't mind just giving us a ranking, it's just a simple kind of 1 through 10. That would be great. Okay.
Hello, am I being heard?
Oh, yep, you're coming through fine.
All right, thank you. Hi, this is Pete. First, Kim, thank you very much for this presentation. I like your thoughts and where it's going. My thoughts are just totally about concerns for the enterprise, because when we start to decentralize, we have like a sense of lack of visibility, and therefore you have a loss of governance. Do you think that waste can be introduced by trying this and trying? I know we need speed, I know we need delivery, but is there a way that IBM is trying to address this in their tool set?
Sure, and I think that, and this is the concern that most customers come with is what are we going to do? And it's not even a case of how do we control it. It's happening already. The decentralized is happening whether you like it or not, and it's more a case of how do we get on top of it. And the reality for most customers, I think, is that the mechanisms they're looking for is there a tool set that we can bring people towards that has pre-built patterns that will enable people to do things in a similar way. So instead of learning all the integration lessons from scratch that we've been learning over the years, that instead those integration lessons are built into the tooling. And so what we're trying to do is build more and more of the patterns that we see, whether it's integration patterns themselves or whether it's the security models that we see around them, and build those into the tools. And also into the way that you're building out, for example, an integration. So when it comes to deploying an integration in the container space, you don't want to have to know how to build high availability or how to build the complexities of load balancing and securing the different parts of a topology for an integration. That should be standard to the way that you work in a container environment. So again, providing things that provide that sort of operational consistency. And so that's really our aim across, seeing it as a platform, seeing it as burnt-in patterns and burnt-in capabilities, so that really the only thing you need to bring to the table is how do I build an individual integration? How do I expose a particular API? How do I provision a particular messaging capability? And that's done as automated as possible so that it's consistent.
So thank you very much. So when we talk about those types of ideas, and how do we ensure that we're getting the necessary skills out of the teams to ensure that we have maturity so that we don't trip over ourselves? I understand that it'd be nice if all of the cloud providers would provide all of the necessary features equally. And, I applaud anybody who is helping any containerization around security that is given as part of your service to allow the deployment of a container. Thank you all, but I don't see equality here.
Yeah, and I think the stage in something that's very new, what we've really best aimed to hope for is that we, and by we I mean all vendors, try to draw together on similar standards. And so making decisions to back Docker containers, making decisions to back Kubernetes, more recent things like decisions to back Istio as a framework for doing microservices or container routing within those environments. I think that's going to be the real key here. And as we all know, standards can be implemented in subtly different ways, and that has its effect. But at least we need to try to pull together on those sort of standards, and that's certainly what we're trying to do from IBM is join with the other vendors to try and do things in as standardized a way as we can.
Thank you.
And Kim, I have gotten a couple of requests for the deck itself, just so that folks can click some of those links that you were sharing at the end. So if you could pass that along, I'll see that it gets shared with all the folks that had participated today.
I certainly will.
And looks like I think you did talk to this a bit, but some is saying, given some of the decentralization of integration runtimes, they're concerned with how a centralized service registry is going to be addressed.
Oh yes, that's a great question. So if we think about there's two aspects to that. So First of all, that's sort of dipping us into the API management territory, because really the modern form of a service registry is the API catalog. That's what we're talking about here. And so how centralized can and should that be? And we'll talk about this in a lot more detail in the API session in a couple of weeks' time. But if you think about the API management capability itself, how much of that could be centralized in terms of its infrastructure? So the management capability is perhaps the same. Perhaps we're enforcing some of the same rules around life cycle of how we move APIs through the life cycle. Have those kind of things managed at a reasonably centralized mechanism, but still be able to do things in a distributed or decentralized way when it comes to actually rolling them out. So maybe pushing API exposure out to gateways that live in different environments, live in different clouds potentially. Perhaps having more than one portal delivering APIs, because there are different sets of APIs across the company. Even though ultimately the design of the APIs is all coming from the same place and it's following the same standards underneath it as well. So yeah, we'll come into that in a lot more detail when we talk about the API aspects, but certainly it really brings into question which parts of the infrastructure through to the actual implementation itself are actually being decentralized.
Great. So taking a look at the chat, I don't see any other open questions at this time. I mean, we can pause here and see if folks would like to ask a question directly to Kim. If not, we can wrap up for the week. And again, just to give you a little more visibility into the next couple of weeks, as Kim said, we are going to be continuing with the benefits of containerization next Friday, and then in subsequent Fridays, a little bit more emphasis on the role of API management and the role of messaging within this Agile integration architecture. So if you've been getting a lot out of these first two sessions, strongly encourage you to come back and continue along for the next few weeks. All right.
Thanks for your time today.
Yeah, thank you again, folks. Kim, as always, I thought it was a great session. I appreciate you leading this. And folks, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend.
Cheers.
Take care.